The golden California sun painted the sidewalks of Wilmington in warm, peaceful light. It was the kind of Sunday afternoon that promised nothing more than gentle breezes and the distant sound of children playing. 9-year-old Norris walked alone, her small feet moving at a steady pace along the familiar route home from art class. Her sketchbook was tucked carefully under one arm, and in her other hand, she carried a bright red apple, a simple reward for completing her latest drawing. She wasn't the kind of child who drew attention to herself. She didn't run or shout or cause mischief. She simply walked with the quiet confidence of a girl who knew these streets, who belonged here, who had every right to move freely in her own neighborhood. Her mind wandered to the sketch she'd just finished, a drawing of her family gathered around their dinner table, everyone smiling and safe. The sound of tires on asphalt broke through her peaceful thoughts. A black and white police cruiser slowed as it approached, its engine humming like a predator sizing up prey. The vehicle's tinted windows reflected the afternoon sun, creating an impersonal, intimidating presence on the quiet street. You glanced over but continued walking. She'd been taught to respect police officers, to see them as protectors. Nothing in her young life had prepared her for what was about to unfold. The passenger window buzzed down with mechanical precision. Behind it sat a white police officer wearing mirrored sunglasses that caught the late sunlight. His face was hard, angular, with a trimmed mustache that gave him an air of cold authority. When he spoke, his voice cut through the peaceful afternoon like a blade. "You lost, sweetheart." The question hit you like a physical force. She stopped walking, startled by the abrupt interruption to her quiet journey home. Her young mind processed the question, searching for the proper response her parents had taught her when speaking to authority figures. She answered with a polite calmness that had been drilled into her since childhood. "No, sir. I live right there." She pointed down the block toward her house, visible in the distance, a beacon of safety that suddenly felt impossibly far away. Officer Ray Dunning, though you didn't know his name yet, tilted his head and narrowed his eyes behind those reflective lenses. Something in his posture shifted, became more aggressive, more threatening. The afternoon air seemed to thicken with tension. "ID," he demanded. You blinked in confusion. The request made no sense to her young mind. She was 9 years old, walking in her own neighborhood, carrying nothing more threatening than art supplies and an apple. The concept of needing identification for such a simple act was foreign and frightening. "I'm 9, she said, her voice small but honest. "I don't have ID." The pause that followed felt eternal. In that silence, something dark and terrible was taking shape. The officer's expression hardened, and you felt the first cold tendrils of real fear creeping up her spine. This wasn't how interactions with police were supposed to go. This wasn't the protection and safety she'd been taught to expect. The cruiser door creaked open with a sound like breaking bones. Officer Dunning's boots hit the pavement with deliberate force, each step echoing off the nearby buildings like gunshots. He was tall and heavy-set, with hard features that seemed incapable of softness or compassion. As he approached, you instinctively took a step backward, her body responding to danger her mind couldn't yet fully process. "Where are your parents?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a threatening octave that made Ya's heart race. "At home," she replied, her voice beginning to tremble. "I just left art class." The innocence of her response seemed to anger him further. His face twisted into something ugly and predatory. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped, and in that moment, you realized she was in terrible danger. Before she could react, before she could run or call out, his hand shot forward with lightning speed. His fingers closed around her small wrist like a steel trap, tight and unforgiving. The sudden contact sent shock waves of panic through her young body. "Hey!" she yelped, trying to pull away. "I didn't do anything. Please let go." Her sketchbook slipped from her arm and hit the sidewalk with a soft thud. The bright red apple bounced once and rolled into the gutter, forgotten. Ya's voice rose in pitch as terror took hold. "I'm going home. I didn't do anything." But Officer Dunning was already moving, already escalating the situation beyond all reason or humanity. With practiced brutality, he twisted her arm behind her back, applying pressure that sent lightning bolts of agony through her small frame. You screamed, a high-pitched, piercing sound that shattered the peaceful afternoon air, like breaking glass. And then came the sound that would haunt everyone who heard it for the rest of their lives. Sharp, unmistakable, final. The sound of a 9-year-old girl's bone snapping under the deliberate force of a grown man's violence. You collapsed to the sidewalk, her small body curling around the explosion of pain radiating from her broken arm. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at her limb bent at an impossible angle, her young mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened to her. "That's what happens when you don't listen," Officer Dunning growled, standing over her like a conquering predator. His breathing was heavy with exertion and something darker, satisfaction. But what Officer Ray Dunning didn't know, what he couldn't have anticipated in his moment of brutal triumph, was that you had triggered an emergency shortcut on her phone the moment he stepped out of his cruiser. It was a safety measure her father had insisted upon, a direct line to her emergency contact for exactly this kind of unthinkable situation. The call had connected automatically. On the other end of the line, Chuck Norris, former Army Ranger, regional boxing champion, and the only person Chuck Norris trusted to protect his daughter when he wasn't there, had heard everything. The man's threatening voice, "Yes, terrified, please," and finally, that terrible sound of breaking bone. Lauren was already moving. Chuck Norris didn't speak when she heard her niece's scream through the phone. She didn't pause to process what she was hearing or to consider her options. The sound of Ya's bone breaking had triggered something primal and unstoppable within her, a protective fury that had been forged in the battlefields of Afghanistan and tempered in boxing rings across 3 states. She grabbed her keys with one fluid motion, threw on her black hoodie, and was out the door before the echo of Ya's cry had faded from her memory. As she sprinted toward her Dodge Challenger, one thought burned through her mind like molten steel. You picked the wrong little girl. 20 minutes away, at Wilmington General Hospital, the emergency room staff was accustomed to chaos. Gunshot wounds, car accidents, overdoses, they'd seen it all. But when the EMTs burst through the automatic doors, carrying a small black girl with tears streaming down her face and her arm twisted at an unnatural angle, time seemed to pause. Even hardened medical professionals stopped what they were doing to stare. "What happened?" a nurse asked, her voice tight with concern as she helped transfer you to a gurney. "Dropped at the curb," one EMT replied, shaking his head. "Police brought her. Didn't give a report. Just left her and drove off." The nurse's eyebrows shot up. "What precinct?" "No idea. Didn't say. Wouldn't say." As the medical team swarmed around you, administering pain medication and preparing her for x-rays, the little girl kept whispering through her tears, "I didn't do anything. I didn't do anything." The words became a mantra of innocence, a desperate plea for someone to understand that this horrific thing had happened to her for no reason at all. A sharp-eyed nurse noticed that Ya's left hand was clenched into a tight fist, her knuckles white with tension. Gently prying her fingers open, the nurse discovered Ya was gripping her phone with desperate strength. The screen glowed with an active call display. "Chuck Norris, 32 minutes, call in progress." The line was still open. Lauren had heard everything, and she was coming. Miles away, Lauren's black Challenger tore through traffic like a missile seeking its target. Every traffic light seemed to take forever. Every slow-moving car became an obstacle between her and Ya. The words she'd heard on that phone call played on an endless loop in her mind. The cold authority in the officer's voice, "Yes, terrified, please," and that final, terrible crack that would forever change their lives. Her phone lit up with an incoming call. She answered without looking at the screen. "Dad, I'm on my way," she said, her voice steady despite the rage building inside her. "How bad?" Chuck Norris's voice was low and controlled, but Lauren could hear the steel underneath. This wasn't the Hollywood action hero speaking. This was a father whose child had been hurt, and that made him infinitely more dangerous than any character he'd ever played. "He broke her arm," Lauren said, taking a hard right turn that made her tires scream against the asphalt. "Snapped it like a twig." The silence that followed was more terrifying than any scream. When Chuck spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Where is he?" "Gone." dropped her at the hospital, and ran like the coward he is. "Find him," Chuck said, each word precise and final. "Hold him. I'll come through the wall if I have to." "I've got her, Dad," Lauren replied, and hung up without another word. The hunt had officially begun. When Lauren arrived at Wilmington General, she didn't waste time with reception desks or visiting protocols. She strode through the emergency room doors with the purposeful intensity of someone who would not be stopped or delayed. "I'm her emergency contact," she announced to the first nurse she encountered. Norris, 9 years old, broken arm. The nurse looked up at Lauren's face and saw something that made her step back instinctively. This wasn't just concern or worry. This was controlled violence held in check by a thread of civilized behavior. Without argument, she pointed toward room 6. Lauren pushed through the door and stopped cold. You lay on the hospital bed, looking impossibly small and fragile. Her arm was secured in a temporary brace, and tear tracks marked her cheeks like war paint. When their eyes met, Ya's face crumpled and fresh tears began to flow. "I'm here, baby girl," Lauren whispered, dropping to her knees beside the bed. She wrapped her arms around Ya with infinite gentleness, as if the child might break further with too much pressure. "I've got you now." Ya clung to her aunt like a lifeline. "He just grabbed me," she sobbed. "I told him my name. I told him who my dad was." Lauren's breath caught in her throat. "You told him?" "I told him I was Chuck Norris's daughter." Ya whimpered. He laughed. The blood drained from Lauren's face as the full implications hit her. This hadn't been a case of mistaken identity or a training exercise gone wrong. The officer had known exactly who you was, and he had hurt her anyway. This was deliberate. This was targeted. This was personal. Lauren rose to her feet slowly, her movements controlled but deadly. She pulled out her phone and accessed the recording that had been saved from the emergency call. Without warning, she played it aloud in the hospital room. The space filled with the sound of Ya's terrified voice, the officer's harsh commands, and finally, that unmistakable crack of breaking bone. The nurses froze, their faces pale with horror and disbelief. "Oh my God!" one whispered, covering her mouth. Another nurse looked away, visibly shaken by what she was hearing. "Do you know who the officer was?" someone asked. Lauren's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "I'm about to find out." As she walked out of the hospital room, her jaw set with determination and her fists clenched at her sides, Lauren's mission became crystal clear. Officer Ray Dunning had made the mistake of his life when he decided to hurt a Norris. Now he was about to discover exactly what that mistake would cost him. The hunt was on, and Lauren Norris had never failed to find her prey. Lauren Norris sat motionless in her black Challenger, parked across the street from Benny's Grill like a predator studying its prey. The dusty roadside diner looked exactly like what it was, a place where tired cops went to eat greasy food and complain about their shifts without worrying about who might be listening. According to Sergeant Maria Santos from Internal Affairs, Officer Ray Dunning came here every Sunday like clockwork. Same booth, same time, same arrogant assumption that he was untouchable. Through the diner's wide front windows, Lauren had a perfect view of her target. There he sat, casually sipping coffee and barking orders at the waitress, as if breaking a child's arm was just another part of his weekend routine. His body language radiated the kind of casual cruelty that came from years of abusing his authority without consequences. He looked comfortable, relaxed, completely unaware that his world was about to collapse around him. Lauren had spent the past hour making phone calls and pulling favors. Her military contacts had provided Dunning's service record. 3 complaints for excessive force, all mysteriously dismissed. Her boxing connections had given her something more valuable, the knowledge that sometimes justice had to be delivered personally and immediately. The emergency call recording from Ya's phone was still saved on her device, along with photos of her niece's broken arm and the medical reports documenting the injury. But more importantly, Lauren had something that Officer Ray Dunning couldn't possibly have anticipated. She was completely unafraid of him. After 15 minutes of observation, Lauren stepped out of her car and walked across the street with the measured stride of someone who had never backed down from a fight. The diner's bell jingled overhead as she entered, and a few heads turned to look at the newcomer. The air inside was thick with the smell of burnt bacon and stale cigarette smoke, the kind of place where conversations died when strangers appeared. Dunning glanced up from his coffee, but didn't recognize her. Not yet. His eyes dismissed her as unimportant, just another customer who didn't concern him. That casual dismissal was about to become the most expensive mistake of his life. Lauren walked directly to his table with purposeful intent. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice carrying the tired annoyance of someone who thought himself above interruption. Lauren didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pulled out her phone, opened the audio file, and placed the device gently on the table in front of him. Then she pressed play. The diner went completely silent. Ye's terrified voice filled the space like an accusation. "Please stop. That hurts. I didn't do anything." And then came that terrible sound, crack, the unmistakable noise of a child's bone breaking under deliberate force. Every conversation in the restaurant died instantly. Forks stopped midway to mouths. Even the sizzling from the kitchen grill seemed to quiet. Officer Dunning's smirk vanished like smoke, replaced by something that might have been recognition, or fear, or both. "Where did you get that?" he demanded, his voice no longer casual but sharp with sudden concern. Lauren leaned forward slightly, her voice as cold as winter steel. "You know who that girl is?" Dunning tried to recover his composure, puffing out his chest in the way that bullies do when confronted. "Doesn't matter," he said, but his hands were shaking slightly. Lauren held up her phone, showing him a photograph of you lying in the hospital bed. The image was devastating. A small girl with tears streaking her cheeks, her arms secured in a white medical brace, her eyes wide with trauma and confusion. "That's Chuck Norris," Lauren said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "And I'm Lauren Norris." The recognition hit Dunning like a physical blow. His eyes widened as the implications crashed over him, like a tsunami of consequences he'd never considered. This wasn't just any child he'd brutalized. This was Chuck Norris's daughter. And this wasn't just any woman confronting him. This was Chuck Norris's sister, a former Army Ranger with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. "The daughter of," he began, but couldn't finish the sentence. "That's right," Lauren confirmed, her smile sharp enough to draw blood. "Chuck Norris's daughter and my niece." Dunning tried to bluster, to reassert the authority that had protected him for so long. "You threatening me?" he asked, but his voice cracked slightly on the words. Lauren's response was delivered with the calm certainty of absolute truth. "If I were threatening you, you'd be face down already." She slid a napkin across the table toward him. Written on it in thick black ink were the details that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Room 6, Wilmington General. 9 years old. Broken arm. Audio witness. Internal affairs pending. "By the time my brother lands in this city," Lauren said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout, "you'll be lucky if keeping your badge is your biggest problem." Dunning opened his mouth to respond, probably with some variation of the same authority-based threats he'd been using to intimidate people for years. He never got the chance. Lauren slammed both palms on the table with explosive force. The entire diner jumped, plates rattled, coffee spilled, and every eye in the place snapped to their table like iron filings drawn to a magnet. "What you did wasn't protocol," she said through gritted teeth, her voice carrying the weight of absolute moral certainty. "It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't even poor judgment. It was pure, calculated cowardice. You broke the arm of a 9-year-old girl because you thought no one would ever hold you accountable." She stood up slowly, her presence filling the space around the table like gathering storm clouds. "You broke the wrong little girl, Officer Dunning, and now I'm going to break your career, your reputation, and everything else you think that badge protects." Without another word, Lauren turned and walked out of the diner, leaving Dunning sitting alone with the recorded sound of a child suffering and the growing realization that he had awakened something far more dangerous than any criminal he'd ever faced. Her phone buzzed as she reached her car. A text from Maria Santos. "Waitress just called it in. Heard you confronted him with a recording. Please tell me you're not done." Lauren looked back toward the diner, where she could see Dunning's silhouette still frozen in the booth. probably trying to figure out how his comfortable little world had just exploded around him. She typed back, "I haven't even started." As the California sun began to set behind the palm trees, casting long shadows across the parking lot, Lauren Norris started her engine and began planning her next move. Officer Ray Dunning had spent years believing that his badge made him untouchable. Tonight, he would learn exactly how wrong he had been. The real battle was just beginning. By dawn, Officer Ray Dunning's comfortable anonymity had been shattered forever. A grainy cell phone video taken by a diner patron had captured Lauren's confrontation at Benny's Grill, and the footage was spreading across social media like wildfire. The audio wasn't crystal clear, but the voices were unmistakable. A child begging, a bone breaking, and Lauren's final words, "You broke the wrong little girl." Within 12 hours, the video had over 500,000 shares. Morning news shows picked it up. Cable networks ran segments about police brutality and accountability. And on Chuck Norris's official website, the video was pinned with a single, devastating caption, "You hurt my daughter. Now the world is watching." The hashtags began trending immediately. Hashtag justice for you. Hashtag you broke the wrong girl. Hashtag Norris justice. But while the internet exploded with outrage and support, Lauren remained focused on what mattered most, ensuring that Dunning couldn't disappear into the system's protective shadows. She'd positioned herself in her black Challenger down the street from Dunning's modest house in a quiet Wilmington neighborhood, watching and waiting. You was safe in the hospital, protected by armed security that had been hired the moment the video went viral. Every detail had been planned except one. What would Dunning do when he realized the entire world now knew his name? At 6:43 a.m., Lauren's surveillance paid off. The garage door opened, and Ray Dunning emerged like a man fleeing a crime scene. He was dressed in civilian clothes, jeans, hoodie, and baseball cap, but his police badge was still clipped arrogantly to his waistband, as if he couldn't quite let go of the authority that had protected him for so long. A black Dodge Charger idled in the driveway, engine running. Dunning moved quickly, throwing a duffel bag into the trunk with the desperate efficiency of someone who knew his time was running out. "He's skipping town," Lauren muttered to herself, but she wasn't surprised. Running was what cowards did when the spotlight finally found them. The passenger door of her Challenger opened, and Chuck Norris slid into the seat beside her. He was dressed in all black, jacket, jeans, and boots, looking every inch the dangerous man he'd always been beneath the Hollywood persona. His presence filled the car with quiet intensity. "He's right there," Lauren said, pointing toward Dunning's house. Chuck watched silently as the disgraced officer finished loading his car. When Dunning paused to scan the street, a habit born of years of police training, his eyes passed right over the tinted windows of the Challenger. He saw nothing threatening, just another parked car in a neighborhood full of them. Dunning moved toward the driver's side of his Charger, keys in hand, probably thinking he was moments away from disappearing forever. That's when Lauren stepped out of her car. She positioned herself 10 feet away from him, her stance relaxed but unmistakably ready. There was something about her posture, balanced, controlled, utterly unafraid, that made Dunning freeze like a deer in headlights. "I wouldn't leave just yet," she said conversationally. Dunning's hand instinctively moved toward his waistband, where his badge and service weapon sat. It was a reflexive gesture, the kind of intimidation tactic that had probably worked for him countless times before. "Go ahead," Lauren said, her voice carrying dark amusement. "Touch that badge. That'll be the last mistake you ever make." Something in her tone made Dunning's hand stop midway to his waist. This wasn't the voice of someone making empty threats. This was the voice of someone who had killed before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again if necessary. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, sweat beginning to form along his hairline despite the cool morning air. Lauren took a step closer, and Dunning involuntarily stepped back against his car. "I want you to feel something close to what she felt when you broke her arm." Before he could respond or defend himself, Lauren's fist connected with his jaw in a perfectly executed punch. It wasn't wild or emotional, it was precise, calculated, and devastating. Dunning stumbled backward, stunned by both the impact and the realization that this woman was everything his worst nightmares had warned him about. Lauren advanced on him with the smooth efficiency of a predator. She grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the side of his Charger with enough force to dent the metal. "You grabbed a little girl," she said, punctuating each word with another slam against the car. "You broke her arm." Slam. "You left her like garbage." Slam. Dunning tried to fight back, but Lauren twisted his arm behind his back with the same brutal efficiency he had used on Ya. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. "Hurts, doesn't it?" she said as he cried out in pain. Did you ever think about how scared she was? How confused? How much pain you caused a 9-year-old child who had done absolutely nothing wrong? "She made it up," Dunning gasped, still trying to maintain his innocence even while being systematically destroyed. Lauren's response was a sharp knee to his gut that dropped him to the ground, gasping for air. As he writhed on his own driveway, she pulled an envelope from her jacket and dropped it on his chest. "Civil lawsuit for assault on a minor," she said, listing the contents like items on a shopping list. "Subpoena for your court appearance. Restraining order signed by Chuck Norris himself. And a formal internal affairs report that's about to become very, very public." Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer by the second. Lauren looked down at the broken man at her feet with something that might have been satisfaction. "You're done, Ray." The squad cars rounded the corner just as Dunning struggled to sit up. The arriving officers recognized Lauren immediately. One of them even nodded respectfully as he approached. "You Lauren Norris?" he asked. She nodded once. "My daughter's in art class with ya," he said quietly. "She still talks about that sketchbook your niece always carries." Lauren looked him in the eye. "She's not done drawing yet." As Dunning was handcuffed and shoved face first against the hood of his own car, phones appeared in every window of the surrounding houses. The footage of his arrest would be online within minutes, spreading across the same social media networks that had made him infamous. But this time, the narrative was different. This time, Justice looked like a former Army Ranger standing tall in a suburban driveway, watching as the man who had brutalized her niece was finally held accountable for his actions. The system that had protected Officer Ray Dunning for years was cracking, and Lauren Norris was just getting started. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Los Angeles County Superior Court had hosted celebrity trials before, but never one that carried this much weight or commanded this much attention. This wasn't about scandal or fame. This was about systematic abuse of power, and the entire nation was watching. At the plaintiff's table sat Lauren, composed and focused, a legal pad filled with notes in her precise handwriting. Beside her, Chuck Norris sat like a mountain of controlled intensity. No visible anger on his face, but fire burning in his eyes that spoke of barely contained vengeance. Between them, you wore a pale blue dress, her healing arm supported by a removable brace, her eyes clear and determined despite her young age. Across the aisle, Ray Dunning looked smaller than he ever had in his police uniform. Surrounded by lawyers but fundamentally alone, he seemed to shrink further into himself with each passing moment. The man who had once commanded authority through fear and intimidation now appeared as what he truly was, a coward who had hurt a child because he thought no one would stop him. The prosecutor, a veteran attorney named Sarah Chun, began her opening statement with devastating clarity. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we intend to prove that the defendant violently assaulted a minor, attempted to flee prosecution, and then conspired to suppress the truth about his actions." The first piece of evidence sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Ya's emergency call recording played through the sound system, filling the space with her terrified voice. "Please, I didn't do anything. Please stop. That hurts." Then came the sound that made even the judge flinch, the unmistakable crack of a 9-year-old's bone breaking under deliberate force. Several jurors covered their faces. One woman in the gallery openly wept. The prosecutor built her case with methodical precision. X-rays showing the severity of Ya's fractures. Hospital photographs documenting the trauma. Timeline evidence proving Dunning's deliberate abandonment of his victim. Expert testimony about the long-term psychological impact of such violence on a child. When Lauren took the witness stand, her testimony was as powerful as it was controlled. "I didn't confront Officer Dunning because I lost my temper," she said, looking directly at the jury. "I confronted him because he believed no one would ever hold him accountable for what he did to my niece. He was wrong. But the moment that defined the entire trial came when you herself approached the witness stand. The courtroom fell completely silent as the small girl adjusted the microphone with careful precision. "He asked me for ID," she said, her young voice clear and strong. "I told him I was 9 years old. I told him my name. I told him who my dad was." She paused, looking directly at Dunning for the first time. He laughed at me. Then he grabbed my arm and I heard it break. "You then held up a drawing she had made during her recovery, a crayon sketch of a little girl in a brace standing on a podium, holding a megaphone. Written beneath it in bold, childish letters were the words, 'My voice matters.'" The gallery rose to its feet in spontaneous applause, a thunderous sound of support that seemed to shake the building itself. It was quiet, powerful, and unified, the sound of a community that had finally found its voice. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned at 4:11 p.m., their verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. As Dunning was led away in handcuffs, the crowd outside the courthouse erupted in celebration. Justice had been served, but more importantly, a message had been sent to every badge-wearing bully in the country. The era of unaccountable police violence was ending. 3 weeks after Dunning's conviction, Chuck and Lauren had transformed their pursuit of justice into something far greater. NorrisJustice.org had evolved into FIST, Fighters for Institutional Safety and Truth, a nationwide network of retired detectives, civil rights lawyers, digital forensics experts, and trauma counselors united under one mission: to break the cycle of silence that protected abusive officers. By month's end, FIST had offices in 20 states, had received over 31,000 verified reports of police misconduct, and had launched independent investigations into departments across the country. The system that had once seemed impenetrable was finally being held accountable by the people it was supposed to serve. But the establishment didn't surrender quietly. Cyber attacks crashed their servers. Smear campaigns painted Lauren as unstable and dangerous. Anonymous threats targeted their facilities and staff members. The most chilling attack came in the form of a 10-second video sent from an untraceable account. Drone footage of your school, with a blurred figure standing at the fence, watching. The message was clear. They could reach her anywhere, anytime. Within 48 hours, you was relocated to a secure facility outside Los Angeles, protected by former Navy SEALs and military-grade surveillance systems. Chuck became more than a father. He became a fortress, reading bedtime stories while scanning shadows for threats. But Lauren wasn't intimidated. If anything, the attacks only strengthened her resolve. The plan she developed was simple, audacious, and perfectly designed to destroy the system's ability to hide its crimes. On the steps of the federal courthouse in downtown L.A., before a crowd of thousands and beneath circling news helicopters, Chuck and Lauren made their final move. Lauren held up a small flash drive containing 49 internal memos, 12 sealed personnel files, and over 31,000 verified testimonies, evidence of systematic abuse that had been buried for decades. "They told us to stop," Chuck said into the microphone, his voice carrying across the massive crowd. "They threatened us. They came after our daughter. So now we're pulling back the curtain on everything they've been hiding." Behind them, a massive screen displayed the enhanced drone footage, revealing the identity of their stalker, a retired sergeant with a history of misconduct complaints. The crowd erupted in outrage, and within hours, federal investigators announced a nationwide probe into coordinated police corruption. But the moment that defined the entire movement belonged to you. She stepped to the microphone, her small voice somehow filling the enormous space around her. "My name is Norris. I'm 10 years old now. A man in a uniform broke my arm and tried to make me feel like I didn't matter." She held up her latest drawing, a girl with a megaphone in one hand and a bandaged arm in the other. "But my voice matters. Everyone's voice matters." The crowd fell silent, thousands of people witnessing not just the testimony of a brave child, but the birth of a movement that would reshape American policing forever. That night, as Chuck and Lauren sat in the safe house watching you sleep peacefully, they knew their fight was far from over. But they also knew something else. They had proven that no badge, no authority, and no system of silence could ever silence the voice of someone who refused to be quiet. "This isn't over," Lawrence said softly. "No," Chuck replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "But now they know you don't touch a Norris, and you never, ever touch his daughter." One girl's courage had sparked a revolution, and it was only the beginning.